And now for today's program. Glenn Frankel is the author of 5 books, and he worked for many years at the Washington Post, serving as bureau chief in London, Southern Africa, and Jerusalem, where he won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. Glenn is a special contributor to Moment magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Susan Rubin Suleiman has published more than a dozen books and over 100 articles in international journals. She is the C. Douglas Dillon Professor of the Civilization of France and Professor of Comparative Literature, emerita at Harvard University. Susan has won many honors, including fellowships from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Robert Siegel was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Robert is also a special contributor to Moment magazine and also serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment magazine's book and opinion editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. She recently won first place in commentary from the Religion News Association. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Please welcome Glenn Frankel, Susan Rubin Suleiman, Robert Siegel, and Amy E. Schwartz.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I am going to invite you all to join me and my distinguished guests in a time machine. We're in 1968, April and May. The news is full of accounts of campus unrest, students occupying buildings, particularly Columbia University. On in April of 1968, the students occupied 2 buildings at Columbia, Low Library and Hamilton Hall, which you've seen on the news, demanding that Columbia cut ties with a military think tank consultant and that they cease to build a gym in Harlem. They 6 days later, with these demands not met, the police cleared Hamilton Hall, lots of unrest, lots of injuries, and this was followed by lots more action by the faculty, student organizing, faculty organizing, and a second police bust in May. Now, all 3 of you were present at this Columbia unrest in 1968 in different roles. Susan as a young lecturer at Columbia College, a member of the faculty, Robert as a student journalist for WKCR radio station, and Glenn as a freshman. I'm going to turn that order around, starting with you, Glenn. Can you say what you remember about those days?
Oh, I remember a lot more than I'd care to tell. I just turned 18. I was a freshman, as you said, in the college, which was a very small part and still is a very small part of Columbia University. I think there were like 3,000 of us there. Hamilton Hall, which has been in the news again because students occupied it, I guess, last week, was the center of our, studies, the place we went for our beginning courses. Columbia was, as I recall, was a very cold and grim place. I mean, most of the faculty was not interested in teaching, freshmen and sophomores. They were looking to do research and get promoted. I can't recall having one woman professor in 4 years, nor one African-American professor or anyone of color in my 4 years there. The crime rate was pretty high in New York in those days and going up, and Columbia didn't feel like a terribly safe place. The dorms were tiny. The food was terrible. And my sense of alienation was almost complete. At 18, I could be drafted and sent to Vietnam, and I could drink because the drinking age in New York State in those days was 18, but I couldn't vote. Martin Luther King had been assassinated at the beginning of April. Lyndon Johnson had stepped down, had announced he was resigning as president. The climate, the political climate was just as, I would say, toxic as the one we're in now, though we didn't have all the benefits of social media to move everything at warp speed. And the campus had been boiling for months and months. SDS was the major sort of force on the far left at Columbia. its often stated goal was to destroy the university or disrupt it enough until the university became what SDS thought it should be, a center of anti-war protest, and standing up against the establishment. The rhetoric was, pretty obnoxious, and the goals were pretty obvious. And as I said, I was
Can you
sitting there.
define SDS for us, Glenn, for the young?
Students for a Democratic Society. It had been founded in the early 60s. It had a very radical agenda. They were big fans of Fidel Castro in Cuba, a little less so of the Soviet Union. But generally, and they were the folks who eventually evolved into the Weathermen, which carried out a terrorist bombing campaign, but that comes much later. Anyway, it was things had been boiling all year. As you had mentioned earlier, there was trouble over the two things. Columbia, which didn't have much spare land, had a gym that must have dated back to the 1890s or so. And they wanted to build a modern facility, and not having the land themselves, they decided to build it in Morningside Park, which was bordering on Harlem. It was the only park really in Harlem, and they just sort of pushed it through. That became our kind of civil rights issue, how Columbia could get away with that. And at the same time, Vietnam, which was, in the background, we were trapped. I mean, you couldn't leave school because then you were subject to the drafts. So as much as you might like to get out of this place, there was no place to go. And that's what it looked like when suddenly things exploded.
Boy, terrible. Robert, do you want to pick up the story and talk about what it was like to cover?
Well, when things exploded, I was a senior in college, and a friend who had graduated the year before and was by now in law school, he and I had spent many, 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 many hours at the radio station WKCR, and we began talking about how this thing that was starting, this occupation of buildings, how we would cover it, how if we were to do it. And by the time we walked to WKCR, we met up with other people who worked there, and we decided we would cover it. And I became the anchor of our coverage and the co-producer. So to me, first of all, just very personally, it's a life-changing moment. I was very purposeless and really didn't know what I was doing or going to do when I left Columbia, and discovered this role of being a useful, very well-informed, not an activist, but so somehow necessary to our little society at Columbia, and decided, boy, if I could do this for a living, uh, this would beat being a lawyer or a doctor or something. This is what I want to do.
The
And
rest is
so
history.
the rest is, well, it's my history. So I'll never forget it. I think that Glenn's description of Columbia as a rather uh, as institutions go, rather uncaring toward its. Yeah, I remember visiting a friend at Yale a couple of years later. I was amazed at how cushy their surroundings were, how spoiled they were by comparison. Um, this was uh, a time of great tensions. As Glenn mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated earlier in the month, and what happened to me, the core of what happened is this. Um, there were two issues, the war and civil rights. And one of them, the war, uh, was extremely controversial. And people felt that anyone who protested was protesting against our guys who were fighting. And most students did not share a love of the North Vietnamese, which the SDS seemed to elevate to admirable heights. But the other issue, the one about the park, public parkland in Columbia building a gymnasium on it, uh, it did seem to be uh, our local civil rights issue, and there actually was a division. The first the buildings were just occupied, and then the black students in Hamilton Hall told the white students to go take some other buildings and go have your own revolution. This echoed something that had happened a couple of years earlier when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee threw the whites out and said, we can't go on with this appearance that whites are running the thing and that we have to We have to listen to their advice all the time.
Hmm.
And so there were two different protests. When the police eventually came after 6 days of the buildings being occupied, the police action at Hamilton Hall, occupied by the Student Afro-American Society. This was the first time I remember learning to say Afro-American or African American or something. It was a novel, a linguistic turn that was being made in public discourse about that time. And their arrests were pulled off flawlessly, cleanly.
Not violently, you mean?
Not violent. The students walked out, or if they had to be carried, they'd be carried out 4 cops to a protester to make sure no, because the city and the police did not want Harlem down the hill, down Morningside Heights, below Morningside Heights, to erupt into rioting. And if there had been violence against the black students, this was feared. So that was a very carefully done, um, good execution of police force. Then came the rest. Then came all of these other white kids in the buildings, and that varied from some students walking out and saying, "If just take me, put me under arrest," and that was it, to students blockading the entrance and there being brawls with the cops and heads being bloodied and some limbs being broken. And it was a case of the police losing discipline, or maybe some said dishing out punishment for what they thought was the abusive attitude of privileged students, as these police had been around us. It was a turning point. I'll say one last thing, that the violence, to me, my whole memory of the time is very much affected by what Glenn alluded to, which was the fact that part of SDS evolved into the Weather Underground, and among them, an old high school classmate and friend of mine, Ted Gold, whom Glenn also met. And 10 went off into this movement, the Weather Underground, which after we graduated, they kind of staged a riot in Chicago, the Days of Rage, and they were calculating that violence and police violence at Columbia had radicalized a lot of students. It could radicalize a lot of teenagers in Chicago, and they provoked violence. They learned the catalytic effects, politically catalytic effects of violence. And a couple of weeks after I bumped into Ted Clark on the Columbia campus when I was back for journalism school, and we talked about this for a couple of hours. And a couple of weeks later, he blew himself up accidentally while preparing explosives in a Greenwich Village townhouse, killing another young woman.
Ted
And
Gold, this was?
Ted Gold was, yeah, yeah. And to me, it's made it very difficult in the years ever since to exoticize terrorism too much, because I felt that I knew people, I had classmates, I had friends who had somehow convinced themselves that violence was a useful political course. And I found there's another story involving a man named David Gilbert, who only a few years ago got out of prison he had somehow taken radical politics into being the getaway driver for a holdup of a Brinks truck. I mean, it was loony. It's thinking back on it, it's nuts. But when the movie was going forward, we watched these people evolve from a position of being sort of intellectual radicals, and then becoming self-consciously tough guys ready for the battle in the streets. So those are my memories, personal and more political, of those days.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think we want to circle back to after this round is when we start talking about the present, which we don't want to do just yet, is this question of, violence has been used in this case and also lately to impose control, and instead, once violence is involved, you often see a loss of control. You lose control of the situation once things get violent. But
Yes, I
first,
would just distinguish, though, between violence and force, and the use of force. The police used force to arrest people at Columbia just this past year, but they weren't just slugging people, with truncheons or billy clubs. There was violence at Columbia in 1968, and not just carrying people up or putting cuffs on them. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah. So, Susan, you were on the faculty and you had a very different uh, sort of prism on the action, right? I mean, talk about what the faculty was
Well,
doing.
yeah, yes and no. Yes and no, Amy. I mean, I certainly agree with what Glenn and Robert that the institution itself was somewhat, even from my position, very hierarchical and patriarchal. Glenn mentioned he had no women professors. Well, that's not surprising. He was at Columbia College, an all-male college at the time. It didn't become co-ed until much later. There was Barnard across the street, but still there was real separation. So Columbia College, and I should say that I was the first woman to be appointed a full-time faculty member at Columbia College, not anything any other school, but Columbia College. So I had this distinction, but great. Nevertheless, I was very much a low person on the totem pole. I was an instructor. I was still a graduate student at Harvard, actually, technically, but I was a full time, I was living in New York. I had gotten married a couple of years earlier, and my husband was a graduate student at Columbia. So we were very involved with Columbia. I mean, but I also was close to the students. I was close to them in age. I was in my 20s. And I was close to them in feeling that the institution was rigid and I say sort of everything was top down. Even the decision about the gym, that was one of the big factors in there, is that the university went ahead to, constructing with plans to construct the gym without asking anybody in the community to put their 2 cents in about what should be done, how should it be done so that the community would benefit from it. So all of that I agree with. Now, as to my position as a faculty, it's true that was somewhat different, and I was, it was a kind of heady moment because as soon as the students occupied Hamilton Hall, and then 2 days later Low Library, that was April 23rd and 25th, the faculty or some members, over 100 or more than maybe 200 people, got together in what was called the Ad Hoc Faculty Group, AHFC, which started handing out mimeographed pages about positions and so on. And their desire was to come to a negotiation between the students and the administration to avoid a police bust. So there were members of our steering committee were shuttling back and forth, between the president and the students. So that was one group that I joined because that group was extremely democratic, unlike all the other hierarchies in the university where full professors were gods and then associate, assistant, and then instructors and whatever. Here we were all sitting around in this big room in Philosophy Hall, trying to figure out what the heck to do so that there wouldn't be any police on campus. This lasted until the police bust. We were handing out. I mean, I actually found all kinds of documents which I could show you, but blue mimeographs, barely readable, with all the signatures of the people, some of whom very distinguished members of the faculty, and others young little people like me, who would never normally have interacted with these higher up. So that was a heady moment, and it was my fondest memory of that period. And the other memory that I have a very clear memory of, two others, is one of the things that the Ad Hoc Faculty Group decided to do was to stand in front of Hamilton Hall and form a human chain so that if the police came, they would have to battle us. So standing there, I remember one day, they didn't come that day. Okay. And then the other thing that was really great was that I wanted to go on teaching, though, because I mean it was the spring, the finals were approaching. So I should point out that although yes, SDS was very, and the violent groups later, they were very present, but the way this was presented to the community at the time, it was a strike. That is, they didn't identify themselves as SDS or anything like that. they kept signing also other mimeographed statements saying Student Strike Coordinating Committee. So this was a strike. That means they didn't want to go to classes. And if you tried to hold classes in Hamilton Hall, of course, that was impossible, but wherever, they would picket you. However, they encouraged the faculty to go out on the lawn and to teach on the lawn. And so I just found, I thought this would be amusing to show. There was here's one of the mimeograph documents I found in my
Push it up
files.
close, yeah, so we can see
Can you see? Can
the
you see? It
period
says
liberation.
liberation classes Friday. So some of these liberation classes were ad hoc. Somebody came up with it. For example, alienation from Hegel to Columbia. That was one new liberation class. But there was another one called Complit 3076, the adventure novel by a wonderful scholar named Paul Zweig. He just moved his class outside, in front of Hamilton. And here I found my own name, Mrs. Suleiman. Mrs. Suleiman, not doctor. I wasn't a doctor yet. French, whatever, second year French, Hamilton, in front, it says in front of Hamilton Hall. So we would meet in front of Hamilton Hall, which means I could go on teaching, my students could go on doing their work, and we felt that we weren't breaking the strike. So those were and then of course I do remember that on the night of the police bust, because despite this well-meaning ad hoc faculty group, in the end, the police were called. So on the night of April 29th, which was Sunday night, Monday, the police came, and Robert has already described it, so I won't go into that. But my husband and I were on College Walk, prudently staying, to the side by the sundial, which is the place where a lot of people gathered. And there were people, and there was one tenured faculty member who was actually arrested and clubbed slightly. But we were there, and then the next day, that was really extraordinary. The very next day, there was a kind of revulsion on the part of the whole campus and all of the faculty, the joint faculties of all the schools of Columbia, not just Columbia College, but the law school, the business school, the School of International Affairs, all got together and said something has to be done. This university has to be restructured. And so I found another document where they say we propose that the university appoint an executive committee to deal with these restructuring issues and to deal with the trustees. And they named, the most distinguished members of the faculty on this executive committee: Daniel Bell, Lionel Trilling, Ernest Nagel, who was a scientist,
philosopher.
Michael Sauver. I'm sorry, what did you say?
He said philosopher. Ernest Nagel was a philosopher.
Ernest Nagel was a philosopher.
Sorry, I meant Polycarp Kusch was a scientist.
He's a physicist.
Yes, and the philosopher Ernest Nagel, Michael Sauver, a political scientist who later became the first Jewish president of Columbia. So this very distinguished group began to deal with the trustees and eventually, make recommendations, including not building the gym, severing ties with the IDA, with this Defense Analysis Institute, and which the students had asked for, and also saying that the students there should be no disciplinary action against the striking students. So in a way, I remember that this whole thing went on then for weeks and weeks. The ad hoc faculty group was dissolved, but a new group took its place. It's called the independent faculty group, which again handed out, mimeographed sheets and all that. So something came of it.
That's interesting. And it sounds like a
positive thing.
Well, it sounds like, first of all, the faculty had a certain instinctive support for the students, not necessarily not necessarily the whole program, but just for them and for keeping them safe and defending their rights. And it does sound like in the end, a lot of those things happened. Maybe one of the things that's interesting about this is it's my impression is that one of the things about the student protests in 68, they were kind of going the same way as the society ended up going in general. The fact that afterwards there, parietals were eliminated, and there were a lot of changes that were in the air, and maybe was what pushed it. And I don't know if that's the case nowadays with what's going on, or if it's something different. But let's do a round on, I mean, Robert talked a little bit about the lasting effect on him, but there may be other aspects. Let's do another round starting with Glenn. What do you think are the lasting effects of going through all this, now to you now?
Well, for me personally, and again, I'm just on the ground there, feeling my way, feeling very alienated from everyone, including the faculty, which, I mean, the faculty seemed to think they were in the process of negotiating between the administration and the students, but I don't know what students they were talking to. And in the end, they were ineffective in that first week because the police came. And the police bus was an enormous revelation for me to see. They arrested 700 people. They sent 150 people to the hospital, including my Spanish instructor, who they threw over a hedge and broke his arm. I got hit on the head. It just was kind of, it was further alienation, if you will. But it was an example, interesting, because the police did it again, even more violently a few weeks later. And the net result of this police violence, the administration had sort of used the last weapon it had, the big weapon that it really didn't want to use, but felt it had no choice. And the result was that the president of Columbia lost his job. The vice president of Columbia, David Truman, a very talented man who everybody thought was going to be the next president of Columbia, ended up at Holyoke University in the Connecticut River Valley. There was a lot of change, and as Susan points out, a lot of reform and a lot of things that we looked after. The charges weren't dropped against everyone. They weren't punished on campus, but a lot of people, some friends of mine, faced charges, that they had to deal with, and a lot of people dropped out. I hung in there because I didn't want to get drafted. The impact on me was to begin to think about how I was going to survive in a country that was carrying out the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon was elected, which was, not a happy moment. Yes, there were many cultural changes occurring, but the country was going through a very dark period. And and we're getting out of school. I graduated in 71. I really had to find a way to live in the world, to live in the United States. I didn't want to move to Canada. I didn't want to go to prison as a conscientious objector. I spent a summer on a kibbutz in 70 and decided that that wasn't going to work for me, that I'd be trading one war for another, if you will. And I think it began the process of deciding how I could function. And that process inevitably, well, it wasn't inevitable at the time, but it brought me into journalism, because journalism was the kind of career where I could be both an outsider and be a critic, and also be an insider, learn about how a community worked, play a role in reform. It just really fit my personality and my sensibility and my sense of alienation from, just about every side politically. Right. So it had a lot of impact on me. But at the time, I'll tell you, like a lot of people who go to college, I feel like I wasted at least 2 years of my academic time there. And when I got out, when I graduated in 71, I felt like I was getting out of prison. Wow. That I would be responsible for my own life after that. I could get a job, make money, pay for myself, have a life, independent, and make my own decisions, and get away from an institution that I thought was pretty hopeless.
Yeah, I wonder if, people sometimes romanticize protests and say, "Oh, those were the great, exciting days." And I wonder if you all and also the students today are maybe going to look back with feelings more like yours, Glenn. But Robert, do you want to?
Well, I think students who were inside buildings recall it as an exhilarating experience quite often, and as a unique moment in their time at Columbia. And we certainly at the radio station, I mean, for us, it was an exhilarating time because we were doing for real what we'd been hoping to do for a long time. So, and I feel very much akin to Glenn in really relishing this position of being well informed, knowing what's going on, and not being a player.
Yeah.
Whatever the opposite of an activist is. I was a pacifist, and I found that position, that stance, to be remarkably
A,
comfortable.
a passivist as opposed
I
to a pacifist.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I would raise one thing in Columbia's favor in all this, and I was a fairly unsentimental graduate of Columbia. I spent my commencement day in the studio, and some lower classmen had my robe so that they could walk out in sequence and tell us what was going on inside of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where they moved the commencement to. But Columbia made several changes as the result of all this, including having a university, a faculty senate of some sort, which there had been none of, including um, having tripartite disciplinary bodies to hear people. And I think also that it's my recollection, I tried to check this, that they moved up commencement, that the whole academic calendar was moved up by a couple of weeks to minimize the number of beautiful, sunny, balmy days before final exams that students would have. I mean, there was a lot of sort of dumb attempt to prevent future protests. One thing which many universities did in response was to institute reforms that no students had asked for. And they went ahead and very often eliminated all kinds of requisite courses. And Columbia, which had always touted its core curriculum as being the centerpiece of the undergraduate education, stood by it and kept it, and did not make substantive academic intellectual changes to the life of the university, although it 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 did cost them the presidency. I should just say Grayson Kirk, the president of Columbia, the day after the bust. I mean, the morning, it was the same morning. This had been going on until 4 o'clock in the morning. But that day he held a news conference in the rotunda of Low Library, and I went to go record what he said and get a question in, I think. And somebody asked him, when do you expect classes to resume and the university to get back to normal? And the president of the university, who has just called in the cops, and there's been this chaos all night long, and blood everywhere. Said, well, I think, and it didn't help that he had a stammer. Also, he was not an easy, friendly person, and he had what I'm doing right now. He did. He stammered, and he said, I don't think that it'll be possible for us to get the morning classes underway, but by the afternoon, by 1 o'clock, we should be able to be to back. And there was a gasp in the room, and some guy who was I think a newspaper reporter, he may have been with the Times, started shouting at him. He said, you just bloodied the heads of your students that all over there. Do you know what's going on? Are you crazy? Do you think classes are going to resume at 1 o'clock? And Kirk stammered somewhat, and we could get a sense of how of what the next couple of months were going to be like. It was a slow learning experience for the leadership of the university. But I'll never forget, this morning it would seem there were never classes. The university went on strike for the rest of the academic year, and you could graduate.
The liberation classes.
There were liberation classes, Susan's right. But the university president thought we would be ready by the afternoon after the bust to resume.
Amazing.
Work.
Yeah, slow learner.
Yeah.
Wow.
Instead, what happened that afternoon was the coming together of the joint faculties of all the faculties and their declaration that they were naming this executive committee and so on. So the work was just beginning, the work of all this attempt to restructure, But
Susan, can I just ask parenthetically, did the faculty also share this impression that the administration was just completely on the ropes, had no idea how to manage this? Is that why they came together?
That's why the executive committee was named, because I can read you what it says here. It says they adopted, all the faculties came together on that same day, where Mason Kirk said there would be classes. Well, instead there was the joint faculty meeting in a different building on College Walk. and they're saying that they're calling for, number one, the university should set aside Wednesday, 2 days later, for reflection, so that without classes, students and faculty may meet and reason together about their university. Two,
Mm.
that there be an executive committee with power to call the faculty together and to take other needed steps to return the university to its educational task at the earliest possible moment. But basically, and then the appointment of a tripartite disciplinary committee. I mean, basically they're talking about, how should we change the university. So I just wanted to get back to, if it's my turn, is it my turn? Uh, uh, to a couple of things that you guys have been saying, which I think on the one hand, and I wonder whether Robert and Glenn felt this, but I'm sure they did to some extent, because I felt that these were historic times. I mean, I think we all had a sense in the late 60s that something was going on. And indeed, a few weeks after this, or in May, there was the famous May 68 that erupted in France, which had huge, long, long consequences. So there was, I mean, there was a kind of Che Guevara was the god for many people. Castro, there were people wanting to change the world. Now, some of it was misguided, violent, whatever. But I think many people felt that something that we were living in history, we were participating in history. And that was, I think, somewhat, and maybe that's why you guys went into journalism. Journalists participate in history in their own way. But I also wanted to say, to make one qualification. Amy, you said it sounds like all the faculty came together to protect the students. Certainly after the bust, there was what, not maybe unanimity, but there was real coming together. But before, I should just tell you a little anecdote. Not everyone supported the student strikes, the student strike or the occupation. There were a lot of indifferent people, but there was a thing called the Majority Coalition, which consisted both of students and some faculty who felt from the beginning, look, law and order. These students are going against the rules. They're destroying private property. They should be disciplined, and they should immediately. I found another piece of paper which said the Majority Coalition demands that the students be, removed and all that. And I should also give you a very personal anecdote, which is that one of my good friends at the university was a tenured professor who later became extremely well known and distinguished as a German historian, Fritz Stern.
Oh,
And for various reasons, because I had typed his manuscript when I was an undergraduate, we became very good friends. He was, a good decade older than I, but we were still. And by 68, he had gotten tenure with the book that I typed, and he was a distinguished member of the faculty. And I was sure that Fritz, of course, would come to the ad hoc faculty thing, and join us and all that. And instead, he told me, "No, I'm totally opposed to what's going on." And it brought back memories of student movements and uprisings in Nazi Germany. Fritz was a German who had lived through the rise of the Nazis. He had arrived in the States in the late, around 39, I think, or 30. I may have that wrong, in the late 30s. And he was almost traumatized by what was going on. He said this reminded him of what he had lived through. And as a result, our friendship suffered for about 2 or 3 years. I mean, we didn't talk to each other for a while because, yeah, yeah. So,
Let me,
so I just would say that personally, what happened to me is that after that year, when everything had calmed down, after May, my husband and I went off to France, where things had just,
or
we got
say,
there in the
yeah.
in the summer of 68, and I finished my dissertation and then got a job in favor of Columbia, I should say. By 69, there were a few women professors. I got a job as an assistant professor at Columbia College. Now, that was major, and I don't know if that would have happened before 1968. That started in 69. I didn't get tenure, but that wasn't entirely their fault. I hadn't published all that much.
Anyway,
But
yeah.
still, so I would say that in my own personal life, '68 marked an important moment and then, of course, I did go back to Columbia and saw it and still lived through a lot of hierarchy. As an assistant professor, I had no right to have a long distance phone.
Right.
Like, would you believe
Right.
that?
That's taking us.
The
Okay, Ted.
phone in your office
Right.
as an
Right.
assistant professor
Okay, yeah.
did not have a long distance line. Like,
Right.
from what?
That is a great segue because I wanted to spend the last 15 minutes talking about now. And I want to bridge to that. It's good you mentioned technology because Robert, you were covering this uprising in with the technology of 1968. You mentioned you actually had to dig up a phone line from the ground in order to report from some courtyard. But I wonder if you would use that as a way to talk about the difference from today's media environment and how that's affecting what's happening. I think, Susan, what you said about how different people experience, unrest and these spectacles through completely different prisms
Well,
is another thing about that's very relevant to now.
I mean, I can give you a couple of snapshots that sum up what the media environment was in 1968. One was the arrival on campus one day of a guy named, in New York City, you don't have to say a guy named Gabe Pressman. Gabe Pressman was Mr. Television. He was one of the earliest of the TV reporters, and he was the local NBC guy who had covered every election in New York forever and was one of the most famous reporters in the city. And as he arrived on campus a day or two into the occupation, he was heard to be asking his campus stringer or whoever, "Where are the narcs? I want to talk to the narcs." And had a completely strange set of expectations of what was going on and of
Meaning what? What does that even mean? I mean, the narcs, the
meaning
people
that the narcs would really know what's going on. If there are a
because
What are
thousand
the
students,
narcs?
because they thought students were just drugging up
yeah, yeah,
in Hamilton and
that must be a
it's
big story. That must be a big story. If there are 1,000 students in buildings doing something radical, they must all be getting stoned on marijuana during that time,
so
and
an
the cops
environment of
must be on the
complete
case.
lack of sympathy, in other words.
Lack of sympathy and complete lack of understanding. Something happened a couple of years before that. I don't know if the name Linda LeClaire means anything to Susan or Glenn Frankel, but I believe it was Iphigenia Sulzberger, who was the mother, wife, and daughter of publishers of the New York Times, and a Barnard College alum. Once went to a luncheon, and an undergraduate, when asked where she was living and what campus housing was like, said that she was living with her boyfriend. And this woman of the New York Times Sulzberger Ox dynasty went back to the paper, and the next thing we knew, there was a New York Times story about Barnard girl describes living with boyfriend. And this woman was subject. I remember Newsweek covered this. This was a national news story about a year before these events. The life on campus, the sort of complaints that Glenn voiced of what it felt like to be a college student at this point was just completely invisible to people making journalistic decisions. And the last one I'll describe is uh, after the bust, there was a story on the front page of the New York Times with the lead of how could human beings have done this? And it proceeded. Everyone who read that who was on campus assumed it referred to the bust and the violence. It referred to the littering and the breakage of things in the president's office. And the byline was A.M. Rosenthal,
So the
who
Times
of the
grandees were
time.
really out in force. Yeah.
Yes, the Times
Uh,
was exercising its muscle in force, and it wasn't all that sympathetic to young dissident people. So
Glenn, I think you wanted to say something.
Well, things just moved a lot slower in
yeah,
1968. Columbia was a big deal, partly because it was in New York, the media capital of America at the time. But it took time for this kind of revolt to spread. But it was the start. I think it was one of the triggers that leads inevitably to Chicago in the late summer at the Democratic Convention, to Richard Nixon's victory. I mean, it had an enormous rolling effect. But and as you pointed out earlier in Europe, where the universities exploded early and often after that. All these things were happening, but the pace of things was much different than today, where this thing takes off, at one college campus and then explodes at so many other places so quickly. Um, and so, students are students. They don't necessarily know a lot about the subjects they're, revolting about, but they think they know enough.
Yes, I think we have a question in the queue which wants to know whether the students, maybe I'm going to put more torque on this than the questioner intended, but do you think the students then knew anything more about the Viet Cong than, say students today know about the different players in Gaza or
No, no, I don't think so. But it really wasn't about the Viet Cong. For most of the students, it was about ourselves. It was
right?
our country in Vietnam, and we knew people were dying, and at the same time, we knew we might end up going there. And
Mm.
so there was an intimate connection in that way, and starting to have big demonstrations in Washington, taking buses down, weekends, surrounding the White House at one point, surrounding the Pentagon, trying to levitate it. These things were starting to happen, but the buildup took much longer, and the power of it. I mean, eventually, the protest movement helped force the United States out of Vietnam. But it took a long time, and it was very different than, say, President Biden deciding this week that he has to suspend that if the Israeli government, if Netanyahu goes into Rafah, invades Rafah, that he's going to suspend weapons for that. I mean, that's like everything speeded up into a much faster timeline. It's interesting how quickly this one exploded, and also how little it was anticipated. I
Which
know
one, Glenn?
Columbia, they felt they were very lucky for a long time this time around that
Right.
things hadn't turned. The president was a little bit almost smug about the fact that they felt they had found a way, a sort of middle road, even though there were things going on. But once, and the president even felt she could skip out on the House of Representatives hearings, which was it seemed like a smart move at the time. But now,
Davos or something, right? I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, maybe she had a dentist appointment. I don't know. But, the point is it caught up very quickly. Our administration didn't anticipate it. I think the opposition didn't anticipate it. But it was students, and whatever you think of of the rights and wrongs of what they're, putting forward, and that could be three more sessions. The fact is that students are out there playing a role and having impact, which very much feels to me a little bit like what happened in '68.
Yeah.
I'm going to take one. I'm sorry, Robert, did you have something to add to that? Or,
I would just add that what happened in 1968 was a global movement of young people, mostly university students. And I throw into that basket Colombia and France, we've mentioned, it came right after. Poland had preceded us. Adam Michnik, the Polish intellectual, one of the leaders against the communist regime, was the student leader of the strike at the University of Warsaw in March of '68. In Later on in the year, there'd be a London School of Economics protest, and the biggest one in Mexico City, just before the Olympics of 1968, ended in police and army sharpshooters killing at least over 40, if not over 300 or so
in
student
Mexico
protesters.
City.
Yeah, in Mexico City.
Wow.
And this is before
68.
World Series, which are remembered for far more modest political statements that were made in those games. But I think Mexico City was by far the bloodiest moment. France was the most influential moment of student revolution. And over the summer, the only thing that overshadows Colombia is what happened, because it did, I think, contribute to the mood of the Democratic National Committee. That came to be the national symbol of young people protesting, cops responding to them with force rather than with
Mm.
reason. And at the time, I didn't realize what we were in the midst of. But by the time, a few years later, looking back on it, it felt to me like one of those years you put a special mark on in the history book. something was in the air at that time.
There's a couple of questions in the queue which ask the same kind of question different ways, and that is, do you think that the media today are are understanding or conveying what's going on the better or worse than then? I mean, somebody said, are they doing better or worse at fairly representing the students and what's going on compared to then?
I think that's a much larger question too, which is the degree to which, unfortunately, the whole thing has become weaponized and politicized by both sides. I mean, today's I have to say personally that today's demonstrations are making me feel much more sad. Maybe not because I'm so much older, but because it seems like there is no, I mean, the two sides, they're not talking to each other at all. I mean, in other words, there's so much misunderstanding. On the one hand, every single criticism of Israel is now called anti-Semitic by people who want to politicize the whole thing. On the other hand, students are chanting chants which to me are horrifying. I mean, sort of implying that what happened on October 7th was perfectly understandable and okay, and Israel should be driven into the sea. For me, that is very terrible. But neither side wants to recognize the rights of the other. So we're seeing the whole replay or a play of all the problems in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is that neither side wants to recognize the rights of the other. The only thing that makes sense is for both sides to recognize that they have historic ties to the land. But no, and I think part of it is that the society is terribly split, and frankly, I think it's the fault of the politicians who are trying to make this into pull it over to their side of the bed, pull the blanket over. This is a proof that this anti-Semitism is going to destroy everything. No, it's a proof that Israel is a fascist state. I mean, like, come on, it's
Yeah, well, you're right. That's a big, we could do a whole nother Zoom just on that. Do you guys want to take it back to the media question or
Yeah, I'm happy
address
to
the
do
same thing?
that.
It's kind of the same question, just larger.
The media is always a step behind, two steps, three steps, and an easy target, scapegoat. Students don't like talking to media. The students want to control the narrative. Everybody wants to control the narrative here, and the media is in charge of the narrative, though its grip is pretty loose. I've seen it, and so I've seen lots of, coverage that wasn't wonderful, but I've seen some coverage that was quite interesting, including, for example, that recent New York Times film account of what was going on at UCLA last week before the police took any action there. I mean, that was a unusual moment of of a riot, if you will, that the cops stood on the sideline and the university. So, you know. I mean, we can sit and compare and complain, and you have to understand that I worked for the Washington Post for 27 years. And I think the mainstream media has done a reasonable job of trying to stay on top of this. The question was always, are they going to put a lot of resources into this, or are they going to put a lot of resources into Israel, Gaza, and covering what's happening on the ground there? And at first I think they kind of ignored the thing here, as I did as a reader, as a consumer of media. I was much
Mm-hmm.
more interested. I didn't take the students very seriously. Well, what's happened and the momentum of it and the political impact of it, and whether you like it or hate it, the students have had a real impact on these universities. We've lost a few presidents. We may lose a few more university presidents. They all seem much more well informed and the presidents then and articulate than Grayson Kirk was in 1968. And yet they're suffering the same fate. It's an impossible time. What's going on is something that no matter what you do, things get worse. If you call in the cops and they arrest students, that doesn't work. If you pull back and let students, run rabbit on campus, that doesn't work. There's nothing you can do to really stop the dynamic of this. And that's true for the media too, in terms of understanding what's going on and finding a key to it. So I tend to be a lot more time and having suffered in it for 27 years trying to cover things like this.
Well, and
Yeah,
Glenn,
yeah,
you covered South Africa when this was going. You've covered some
yeah.
polarized places. So what you say, that's you covered Israel, you've
Yes,
covered
and police
Jerusalem.
violence always backfires. Police violence never works in these situations. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe in the Soviet Union, Putin's, or in China in Tiananmen Square, but in a democratic society or anyone who pretends they want to be a democratic society, police violence always makes things worse. And that's what we're seeing now. And yet, if you don't call in the cops, you're stuck to it.
Wow. All
Well,
right. We have a few more
also
minutes, Robert. Yeah. Why don't you
you
wrap
can
us
also
up?
be stuck negotiating if one party to the negotiations really would prefer to see it end in failure.
Yeah.
That's that can be a sucker punch, that I would just
There's
say
not,
the real difference between the media then and now is I think that in 68 there was still so much more respect for authority figures and so much more deference from big institutions to leaders of other big institutions that we were breaking down inhibitions then, which now everyone takes for granted. People, I mean, more people mistrust everyone. I think they'll mistrust their neighbors. Everyone seems to mistrust everyone. That wasn't the case at that time. There was an assumption that the big media and big government knew something of what they were doing and deserved some respect for it.
And do you think that made it easier or harder to follow what was going on?
It made it harder to get an accurate picture of what was going on because we were being that's what we were doing. We
Right. Right. You were
we
trying.
were we were reporting saying that's not true. There
Yeah.
actually was violence on campus,
Right.
and but when you're up against institutions that did either a poor job of reporting that or an insistence on presenting it otherwise, uh, it was it was a world that was much more respectful of powerful institutions and their leaders than the one we now live in part to the changes in part because of things like what happened in 1968.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Susan. We're almost out of time.
I want to say two things. For what it's worth, those of us who were there were reading, of course, the New York Times feverishly every day, and we felt, they didn't get it. They really didn't get it. I mean, so the people who were there, the details weren't all right, but that doesn't mean that they didn't do a good job, I guess. My other point is to respond to Glenn that it never pays to call in, that police violence always backfires. We have a nice test case going on right now because at Harvard, there's an encampment of students. But Harvard, so far, and of course, its commencement is toward the end of the month. So it's definitely planning to do the commencement. But Harvard so far has not threatened police. What it has threatened is expulsion or at least a suspension. So what they're hoping, I think, is that the students will see the light and leave the yard, because if they don't leave the yard, there can be no commencement, and everybody is looking forward to commencement. So I'm curious to know how this will play itself out. I have no idea, but so far the university is simply threatening suspension of the students who are there and begging them to leave. So we'll see what happens.
My impression, by the way, although Glenn said nobody, some people did have some problems in court, although very often there was this police procedure where the arresting officer would be called in and say, and actually the students had been brought into the police wagon where a cop introduced himself and said, "I'm your arresting officer." If that person showed up, and imagine the burden on the New York City police to make the people who arrested 700 students show up to testify in court, especially when the district attorney was a trustee of Columbia University and a former star halfback on the football team. Something would be worked out that relatively few people were damaged by it, and I think that uh, there are, I mean, among the people who were leaders, the leader of the Student Afro-American Society, Ray Brown, became an anchor on court TV. He was a cable TV personality. There was a guy who went to a guy who was called into a disciplinary hearing, a law student who crawled all over the table and made fun of his judges, named Gus Reichbach. He died a few years ago. He died as I believe, a New York State Supreme Court justice. The law professor who heard his case pursued him to the character committee of the bar and everywhere to make sure he wouldn't live down his behavior at Columbia, but it didn't matter. So the lesson for taking part in the protest was you may have spent a night in jail. Maybe some were prosecuted for more than that. I don't think very many. Criminal trespass, typically. And you went back to your Columbia career track, whatever that might be.
Well, we'll see if in this era of doxing and Instagram,
that would be very different. That would be very different.
We'll see if that is, even remotely to be hoped for some of these students. If in fact you hope that. Look, I know we're out of time. There's so much more to talk about. I know Suzanne really wanted you to address one little question, and then I'll pass it back to her. But I want to thank you all, and I also want to tell people in the chat that we will put some wonderful reminiscences from that time. One by Glenn that he wrote some years ago for Mother Jones, and two audio reminiscences by Robert. Which also, if this has whet your appetite for even more reminiscences, they're available. But thank you all so much. And Suzanne, I'm going to let you finish us off because I know there's one question that's near and dear to her.
I know. Thank you very much. We knew we wouldn't get to all of it. There's so many different angles and so many other questions. So I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of it. But one question, we put it in the description, was about the food. A lot of people today there's some viral videos going around about students asking for food, or all of these different encampments having big food spreads, and they're getting criticized. But I think, Glenn, you wrote in your piece about the food, and Robert, you talked about the food. I wonder if you could, that it's not unusual that they're seeking food from the outside.
Robert, you've got to be the expert in this. I thought Morningside Heights was terrible to begin with, and I didn't mind being denied a little of it during the rebellion. What do you think?
I just remember sending out to a place called Takeover for I don't know how many sandwiches, or sending out for pizza. I do not remember food being a difficult issue during that time.
I think the protesters in the buildings were sending down baskets, weren't they, for people to put either money or food in and draw them back up.
I gather, yes.
So protesters have to be fed, I guess, when they're on strike.
But during the time, you could get in and out of the buildings quite easily. So you could go eat and come back. I was bouncing around Fairweather and Avery, and I never slept in one of them because I knew the police were going to show up at some point, but I don't recall food being a problem any more than it usually was.
So again, thank you. One person wrote in and said, I was a graduate student in Columbia in 1968, and I stayed up all night listening to a young anchor named Robert Siegel giving a blow-by-blow description of the bust. And they wanted to know if that recording was available. So I put in the chat a link to a report.
Not recording of the bust. No, there's not. You don't have. I don't think you have that. But,
right, but you narrated a story.
It was a promotion that we did that included sound from the coverage.
Right. So I've put that link in the chat, and again a link to the article that Glenn wrote a few years ago. I will send all of this out in a follow-up email. Again, Susan, Robert, Glenn, and Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. We thank the audience for joining us. Please go to momentmag.com where you can find registration for next week's programs along with all of our other Zoominars. Again, have a good day, and we'll talk to everybody next time.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.